Wow, you guys really came through with this source material for this deep dive request. That's a lot to go through.
Yeah, looks like we've got quite the mystery on our hands.
We're going to be taking a look at the disappearance of Ethan Carter, and you sent over police reports, news clippings, even a handwritten confession.
It's like one of those true crime documentaries, where they start with the official story and then...
And then it takes a turn.
Exactly. And you start to question everything.
So let's start with what we know.
Right.
It's 2021 in Centralia, Pennsylvania. Now, if you're not familiar with Centralia,
It's not your typical town.
No, not at all. It's been dealing with this massive underground coal fire for decades.
So it's pretty much a ghost town, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Smoke rises from the ground. You've got unstable ground. It's a very eerie atmosphere.
I've seen some pictures. It looks like something out of a horror movie.
It does. And it's in this setting that 8-year-old Ethan Carter vanishes while playing hide and seek in the woods.
And from what I've read in the police reports, there were no initial leads, no witnesses, no signs of a struggle.
Silence.
Yeah, just an 8-year-old boy gone without a trace.
Which, of course, immediately casts suspicion on the father, James Carter.
Right. I mean, in these cases, it's often...
Statistically speaking.
Exactly.
And 2 years after Ethan's disappearance, James is arrested in Spain.
Oh, wow. So he had left the country.
Yeah. And he's facing some serious charges. Murder, child abduction, concealment of evidence.
They must have had something concrete to go on to arrest him in another country.
Well, according to the reports, they found forged documents, a good amount of cash, and even a personal journal on him.
So it sounds like he was on the run.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have this handwritten document that was included in the request. It's titled The Last Confession.
Okay, so this is where it gets interesting.
This is where it takes that turn.
Because in this confession, James paints himself as a desperate father framed for a crime he didn't commit.
He claims that Ethan was taken by something else.
Something else? What do you mean?
Something not human.
Oh, wow. Okay, this is starting to sound like one of those stories that make you wonder what's really out there.
That's exactly it. It's not just a missing child case anymore. It reads like a dark fairy tale filled with desperation, a relentless international search, even a chilling encounter in a remote Spanish village.
So he's not just claiming innocence, he's saying something took his son.
And that's just the beginning. We're about to go down a very interesting rabbit hole with this one.
I'm hooked already. Let's hear more about this confession.
Okay, so one of the things that really stood out to me was how James describes the setting of Centralia. He calls it a place forsaken by God, haunted by the ever-burning coal fire.
It sounds like he sees the town itself as almost complicit in Ethan's disappearance.
Yes, and that sense of unease, the smoke, the unstable ground, it all feeds into this idea that something is deeply wrong in Centralia.
It definitely creates an atmosphere where you could believe that almost anything is possible.
Right, and that blurring of reality continues as he describes his search for Ethan. He talks about chasing rumors across continents, following leads that go nowhere.
So each disappointment just pushes him further down this path of obsession.
Exactly. And eventually this obsession leads him to a remote Spanish village, guided by a single whisper of hope.
A single whisper, like a clue or something.
A rumor, really. A very vague one. But he's desperate enough to follow any lead at this point. And the way James describes this village, it's shrouded in mystery, almost mythical in its isolation. Like he's entered another world.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that would fuel his belief in something supernatural being involved.
Absolutely. And it's in this village that he encounters two figures central to his story. A scarred man who radiates menace and a boy who he believes to be Ethan.
But wait, if he found Ethan in this village, then why?
It's not that simple. The boy, even if it is Ethan, seems distant, almost otherworldly. He even notes the boy's vacant eyes, as if he's no longer fully present.
So even though he's found him, he hasn't really found him.
Exactly. There's this chilling sense that Ethan is no longer himself. Yeah. That he's been changed somehow.
Okay, now I'm really curious about this scarred man and what role he plays in all of this.
Well, James claims that this scarred man is the one who took Ethan. He says that Ethan is his now body and soul.
Body and soul. That's a chilling phrase. It suggests something far more sinister than a simple kidnapping. It almost sounds like
a possession.
Yeah, like something has taken over Ethan completely.
And that idea really taps into some primal fears, right? This fear of the unknown, the fear of something taking what's most precious to us.
It's like a story ripped straight out of folklore. You know those stories about children being stolen by fairies or replaced by changelings?
And those stories have been around for centuries for a reason. They speak to something deep within us, a fear of losing control, a fear of the things we can't explain.
But the police reports make no mention of this scarred man or any of these supernatural elements.
Not a word. And that's what makes this case so intriguing. We have these two very distinct narratives, the official one that's based on evidence, and then James's confession, which reads like a dark fairy tale.
So the question is, which one do we believe? Or is the truth somewhere in between?
I think that's the question we're going to be grappling with throughout this entire deep dive.
I'm ready to dive in. Let's see where this rabbit hole takes us.
Me too. Let's take a closer look at the events leading up to James's encounter with the scarred man in that Spanish village.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, James describes a violent struggle with this scarred man, a desperate attempt to get Ethan back.
What happened?
He kills the scarred man.
He kills him.
Yes. But it's a hollow victory. The boy, even if it is Ethan, remains distant, seemingly lost to him.
Wow. That's pretty dark.
It is. It highlights the futility of his quest. He's gone to the ends of the earth, risked everything, even taken a life, and he's still no closer to getting his son back.
It's like a Greek tragedy, where the hero's actions ultimately lead to their downfall.
And the police reports portray him as a calculated criminal trying to escape justice.
So two completely different interpretations of the same events.
And then there's the ending of the confession. He's captured, separated from the boy, and left with nothing but his memories and this plea for someone to believe his story.
So he's basically saying, I did all of this for my son. Please believe me.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
But it also leaves us with so many questions.
Yeah, like, did he really kill someone in Spain? And what about the blood evidence the police found?
And most importantly, what happened to Ethan? Is he still out there? Is he even still alive?
It's like we're dealing with two separate realities here. The official one, and then the one James has created in his confession.
And maybe the truth is a combination of both.
It's going to be interesting to see how we can reconcile these two very different versions of events.
I agree. Okay, so let's move on to the police reports and see if we can find any clues that might support or contradict James's story.
Sounds good. Let's get into it.
All right, let's start with the initial investigation in Centralia.
Okay, so what do the reports say about the early days of the case?
Well, they describe a pretty extensive search effort involving local police, the FBI, even volunteers from the community.
But they came up empty.
Completely. They combed through the woods, interviewed everyone who knew the family, checked surveillance footage, everything.
And there was nothing.
Nothing concrete. No witnesses, no signs of a struggle, no ransom demands.
So from the very beginning, it was a mystery.
A total mystery. And that's what made James the prime suspect. The lack of any other leads and his subsequent disappearance just fueled that suspicion.
Right, because if it wasn't a random abduction, then who else would have a motive to take Ethan?
Exactly. And the reports go into detail about James's financial troubles, his strained relationship with his wife.
So they're painting a picture of a man on the edge who might have snapped.
They're definitely building a case against him. And then there's the blood evidence they found in Madrid.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. But James claims he killed the scarred man in self-defense.
He does. But the police reports link that blood evidence to an unsolved homicide that happened weeks before James even arrived in Spain.
Oh, wow. So that directly contradicts his confession.
It does. And it raises some serious questions about his credibility.
So either he's lying about everything,
or someone is trying to frame him.
That's a possibility too.
Right. Someone who knew about his desperation, about his search for Ethan, and used it to their advantage.
That's a pretty wild theory.
It is.
Yeah.
But we can't rule it out at this point. We're dealing with a lot of unknowns.
True. So what else do the reports say?
Well, they mention James's journal that was found when he was arrested. They don't go into detail about the contents, but they say it contains rambling entries about Ethan, about the search, about this darkness that's following him.
That's interesting. Darkness, what do they mean by that?
It's not clear, but it definitely adds to this sense of something sinister being at play.
It sounds like James is battling his own demons in addition to everything else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the police likely saw those journal entries as further evidence of his instability with his potential guilt.
So we have the official reports painting one picture and James's confession painting a completely different one.
Exactly. And it's up to us to try to make sense of it all.
Which is no easy task.
Not at all. But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
All right, so we've got the police reports, we've got James's confession. What else do we have to work with?
Well, you also sent over a collection of news clippings about the case. It'll be interesting to see how the media portrayed the story as it unfolded.
Okay, yeah, that could give us some more context.
Let's take a look and see what we can find.
Sounds good. I'm curious to see how the public reacted to all of this.
I am too.
So we were talking about how the media portrayed this whole thing as it was happening.
Yeah, let's dive into those news clippings and see what kind of narrative they were spinning.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, so the early coverage focuses heavily on the search efforts. You know, the whole community coming together to try and find Ethan.
I bet that got a lot of national attention, a small town dealing with this tragedy on top of the whole coal fire situation.
Oh yeah, it was a huge story. They even had those like cable news trucks set up in Centralia for weeks.
Ooh, wow. Must have been chaotic.
It was. But what's interesting is how quickly the focus shifted from finding Ethan to suspecting James.
I guess once they hit that dead end with the search.
Right. And the headlines start to get really sensationalized. You know, missing boys, father flees country, is James Carter a killer? That kind of thing.
So they're basically trying him in the court of public opinion.
Exactly. And the news reports at the time, they don't even mention the possibility of a supernatural explanation. They're completely focused on the criminal investigation.
Which makes sense. I mean, that's their job to report the facts.
Right. But it also shows how easily we dismiss anything that doesn't fit into our understanding of the world.
Especially when it comes to something as serious as a child's disappearance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't until James was arrested in Spain that the story really blew up again.
I bet that was huge news.
Oh yeah, it was everywhere. And the tone of the coverage becomes even more condemning. You know, fugitive father captured, justice for Ethan Carter.
So at this point, the media has already decided he's guilty.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the police reports that were leaked to the press, they didn't help his case.
Right. You mentioned the blood evidence and the journal entries.
And it all just feeds into this narrative of James is a desperate, unstable man capable of anything.
It's interesting, though, because even with all that evidence against him, there were still some people who believed him.
You mean who believed his confession?
Yeah, I found a few articles about online communities dedicated to proving his innocence.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, they were convinced that something else was at play, that there was more to the story than the police were letting on.
So even back then, there were people who were open to the possibility of a supernatural explanation.
It seems so, and they latched on to those details in James's confession that couldn't be explained by the official narrative.
Like the scarred man and the Spanish village.
Exactly. They saw those as proof that something truly strange had happened to Ethan.
It's fascinating how people can look at the same evidence and come to such different conclusions.
It really is, and it shows how much our own biases and beliefs shape our interpretation of events.
Absolutely. So we've got the official narrative, the media's take, and then this whole online community that's convinced James is innocent.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But I think it's important to consider all these different perspectives as we try to piece together what really happened.
I agree. Okay, so what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, the discrepancies between James's confession and the police reports.
Right. We can't just ignore those.
Absolutely. Let's start with the blood evidence found in Madrid.
Okay, so the police linked that blood to an unsolved homicide that predates James's arrival in Spain.
Yes, and James claims he killed the scarred man in self-defense.
So how do we reconcile those two facts?
Well, there are a few possibilities.
Yeah.
One is that James is lying about everything, and he was involved in that earlier homicide.
That's certainly a possibility.
Another possibility is that someone planted that blood evidence to frame him.
Okay, but that seems a little far-fetched, right?
It does, but we have to remember we're dealing with a case that already has a lot of strange elements to it.
True. And if we're entertaining the possibility of a supernatural explanation, then maybe framing isn't so far-fetched after all.
Right. Maybe someone or something wanted James to take the fall for Ethan's disappearance.
Okay, now that's an interesting thought.
It is. And it ties into those online communities who believe James is innocent.
They might be onto something.
They might. And then there's the question of the scarred man himself.
Right. He's a central figure in James's story, but he's completely absent from the police reports.
Which could mean that he doesn't exist.
Or that the police dismissed him as a figment of James's imagination.
Exactly. But if we take James's confession at face value, then the scarred man is the key to understanding what happened to Ethan.
He's the one who he's the one who claims Ethan body and soul.
And his presence raises so many questions. Who is he? Where did he come from? And what are his motives?
We don't have any answers to those questions.
Not yet. But maybe we can find some clues in James's journal.
Right. The police reports mentioned it, but they didn't go into detail about the contents.
They didn't, but we were able to get our hands on a copy.
You're kidding. How did you manage that?
Let's just say I have my ways.
Okay, well then let's not waste any time. Let's see what James wrote about the scarred man, about Ethan, about this darkness that was following him.
This is where things get really interesting.
I can't wait. All right, so we're finally about to crack open this journal, huh? This could be the missing piece of the puzzle.
We're about to go deep into James's psyche, see the world through his eyes.
This feels like one of those moments in a movie, where they finally find the key to unlock the mystery.
It really does. Okay, so the journal itself is pretty standard, like a small leather-bound notebook.
Nothing fancy.
No,
Oh.
but the entries themselves, they're anything but standard. They're raw, emotional, chaotic,
Yeah.
sometimes even rambling.
I can imagine. It sounds like he was pouring his heart out onto those pages.
He was. And it's clear from the very first entry that James was already deeply troubled even before Ethan disappeared.
Troubled how?
He talks about feeling lost, disconnected, like he's living in a fog. He mentions having nightmares, vivid ones that he can't shake off.
So there was already a darkness surrounding him even before Ethan went missing.
Yes. And that darkness seems to intensify after Ethan's disappearance.
Makes sense. I can't even imagine what he must have been going through.
The entries become shorter, more frantic, filled with guilt, self-recrimination, even paranoia.
Paranoia about what?
He starts to believe that he's being watched, followed. He talks about seeing shadows lurking at the edge of his vision.
So the seeds of his later claims about being framed were already planted.
It seems so, and the more desperate he becomes, the more those seeds take root.
And then he starts writing about the scarred man.
Yes, and the way he describes him, it's chilling. He calls him a void in human form, a creature of smoke and ash.
Whoa, that's some seriously creepy imagery.
It is, and it's clear that James sees him as the embodiment of all the darkness that's been plaguing him.
Like he's a physical manifestation of his guilt and fear.
Exactly. And the more James writes about him, the more real he seems to become.
So it's like the journal itself is becoming a portal into this other world that James is creating.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And as James gets closer to finding this Spanish village, the entries become even more surreal.
So he's really starting to lose his grip on reality at this point.
He's definitely crossing that line between sanity and obsession. And the encounter with Ethan, or the boy he believes to be Ethan, it pushes him over the edge.
How so?
He describes the boy as a hollow shell, a puppet controlled by the scarred man.
So even though he's found him, he's lost him in a way.
Yes, and that loss is more profound than the physical separation. It's a loss of identity, of connection.
Like the Ethan he knew is gone forever.
And that realization, it drives James to kill the scarred man.
He sees it as the only way to break the connection to reclaim what's been taken from him.
But it's a futile attempt. Even after the scarred man is dead, the boy remains unchanged, distant, unreadable.
So he's trapped in this in-between state, neither here nor there.
And James is left with nothing but this overwhelming sense of failure and the knowledge that he's crossed a line he can't come back from.
And those final journal entries, they're full of regret, despair, even a strange sense of acceptance.
He knows he's going to be captured. He knows he'll likely spend the rest of his life in prison, but his only concern is for Ethan.
He wants people to know the truth about what happened, even if they don't believe him.
And that's what makes this whole story so tragic. Whether he's a murderer, a victim of circumstance, or something else entirely, he's a man who's lost everything.
And we're left with this haunting question. What really happened to Ethan Carter?
Was he kidnapped, murdered, taken by something beyond our comprehension? We may never know for sure.
But I think the real takeaway here is that sometimes the truth is more complex, more ambiguous than we want it to be.
And sometimes the stories we create to make sense of the world, they can be just as powerful as the truth itself.
So we leave you with this. What do you believe happened to Ethan Carter? And what does this case tell you about the nature of belief loss and the limits of our understanding? It's a mystery that may never be fully solved, but it's one that will stay with us long after this deep dive is over.
That's it for this week's Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us. And as always, keep those requests coming.